What is dark money in US politics? The 2022 election cycle is on track to swallow a record amount of cash unseen in the country's midterm history. Data suggests that what's known as dark money is also playing a big part in this year's elections. So who's footing the secretive bills? I'm Saina. Welcome to Factstyle. According to estimates by two nonpartisan research institutions, a whopping amount exceeding $9 billion will be spent on this year's elections. The US media calls this a record for midterm elections, and it represents a massive escalation from recent years, which is double what was spent in 2014, and a 32% increase from 2018. While the midterm elections has no presidential race at the top of the ballot, other races, including for the House, Senate, governor, and down ballot, all have far-reaching political implications. The massive amount of spending reflects the sense of urgency that both parties have for gaining power in Washington and across the country. Throughout history, money has played a consistent role in U.S. politics. As Senator Mark Hanna famously quipped over a century ago, there are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is. American elections are expensive. Advertising, staff recruitment, and campaign events all require deep pockets. Candidates' financial resources are not enough to cover the huge campaign expenditures. So fundraising has become one of their main tasks.
The White House is gearing up to launch an all-out offense for Democrats with less than 2 weeks to go until the midterm election.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump has held a Save America rally in Arizona, promoting his preferred candidates ahead of next month's midterm elections.
Well, I bet there are a lot of efforts. Other than political donations that are publicly reported and easily tracked, nonprofit organizations and the media outlets alike have recently reported that money coming from outside groups, including so-called dark money groups, has broken a record for the highest amount ever spent on a midterm election, totaling more than $1.3 billion. For the political donors dishing out the billions of dollars year after year, what can they get in return? Over the past 2 decades, researchers across the U.S. have been tracking down records and data on the enormous investments in American politics. Studies found that those who participated most in politics got huge returns. They spent billions and got trillions back. On average, for every dollar spent on influencing politics, the nation's most politically active corporations received $760 from the government. Big donors such as retailers and investment banks, construction and telecommunication firms, health insurers and gun makers, entertainment conglomerates, banks and pharmaceutical manufacturers invest because their businesses are intertwined with government decisions, including spending ones. For example, the federal government issues contracts to purchase goods and services that total a little more than $3 trillion. And the top 200 corporate political donors won $1 trillion of that, a third of the total. The Treasury Department managed $410 billion in loans and other assistance issued under a program created by Congress to cope with the 2008 financial crisis. Of that amount, about 73% went to 16 firms among the top 200 donors. When the Federal Reserve took measures in the wake of the financial crisis, it funneled more than $2 trillion through 29 of those top givers. And you know what's even worse? The 200 ultra-big donors mentioned above not only made billions of dollars of disclosed contributions, there is also a portion of their donations that is impossible to track. Well, welcome to America's dark money world, which has been around for quite a while.
Starting in the 1970s and 80s, because of various regulatory changes then, and the rise of the rich and big business deciding that they needed to get into politics and electoral politics in a bigger way, that's when you saw this gigantic increase in PACs. PACs were created. Now there are super PACs subsequently, but that's when this really began, before and after 1980.
Dark money typically refers to political donations funneled through corporations, nonprofits, and other groups, and it's very difficult to trace the actual donor, as the source of the money is not publicly disclosed or made clear. Although the phrase dark money sounds a bit shady, it is in fact legal for this type of mystery money to flow through the US political system. But how come? Well, it all started with a Supreme Court case, which remains controversial to this day. Don't worry, we won't get into too much detail here. I just want to make sure we make it clear how dark money even became a legal thing in the first place. So in 2010, when the Supreme Court ruled on Citizens United case, it removed some limitations that had existed for a long time on spending by political interests. In a nutshell, unions and corporations, especially some nonprofits that are incorporated under a specific section of the US tax code commonly known as 501c4, were suddenly able to spend unlimited sums of money on politics. Why is this change important? Because this 501c4 tax status is a designation reserved for social welfare nonprofits. But this is controversial because unlike other groups, these social welfare nonprofits have a legal right to keep their donors secret, as disclosure may lead to harassment.
We've seen a surge of dark money in politics because of the US Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. That ruling allowed companies, including these types of nonprofit companies, to spend unlimited amounts of money for or against candidates, supporting candidates, opposing candidates, with TV ads, radio ads, all sorts of different types of expenditures.
So for donors who are looking to influence elections but don't want to reveal who they are for whatever reason, this Supreme Court decision opened the door to a really attractive option. It prevents voters from even knowing who is spending to influence the candidates. Some people may say, well, there are criteria for nonprofits to qualify as social welfare organizations. But in reality, the restriction is really hard to enforce. Because according to the IRS regulations, this 501c4 tax status basically means that these groups became classified as working for the well-being of society, as long as politics does not become their primary purpose, and their primary activity is still social welfare. But the real-world problem is, there is no real way to quantify primary purpose. Here's how some groups have taken advantage of the rules. According to a brief filed with Supreme Court, dark money spenders have interpreted the word primary to mean that anonymously funded 501c4s may devote the barest majority of their activities to social welfare, with the remaining 49.999% devoted expressly to political campaign activities. It doesn't end there, however. Dark money controlled groups are able to spend their just over 50% in social welfare downstream to other politically aligned groups, who can then spend up to half of those funds on direct campaign influence and donate the remainder further downstream to other groups within the dark money network. In this manner, dark money donors can create a cascade of downstream entities, effectively spending far more than 50% of their secret political funding on express campaign influence, all free from disclosure and subject to tax benefits. The vast sums of money can be spent on a variety of tasks, including political tech ads, lobbying, and even retreats in exotic locations to educate policymakers. Since the 2010 decision, there has been an explosion in political spending by deep-pocketed interests. Election-related spending from non-party independent groups ballooned to $4.5 billion over the decade. But over the 2 decades prior, it totaled just $750 million. Also, groups that don't disclose their donors flooded elections with more than $900 million, compared to less than $130 million over the previous decade. Secretly funded nonprofits and trade associations that influence elections take money from major companies in amounts that are mostly unknown.
They were just one of many Koch brothers groups that were used to funnel money from place to place, essentially money laundering, so that the original donors' names would not be divulged to the public. And so that permits people who do want to play in politics, who have a really strong interest and give millions of dollars to influence politics, are able to do it without ever being disclosed.
When billions of dollars of dark money floods into the US political system from a tiny, highly unrepresentative part of the population and without leaving fingerprints, I mean, this opens up a can of worms, to say the least. Voters are left uninformed about important political information. Potential conflicts of interest for judges and the legislators could be hidden. And the policymakers are said to be spending more time on issues that matter to their benefactors than to the general public.
You can say about USA Land, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, this is perfectly true. The people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials, but again, only after the funders have had their way with the elected officials. Number two, obviously, dependence upon these funders produces subtle, understated, camouflaged bending to keep the funders happy. Candidates for Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do that, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money.
Researchers have also found that when the preferences of low or middle-income Americans diverge from those of the affluent, there's virtually no relationship between policy outcomes and the desire of less advantaged groups. In contrast, what rich people want has a substantial relationship with policy outcomes, whether their preferences are shared by lower-income groups or not. We've also noticed that dark money and the accusations against it have almost become weapons at the ready for both parties.
That dark money apparatus, and then I began to see that it's a lot of the same groups that are backing the Republicans, just like we described in the $1 billion in this election for Republican Senate candidates. And then as I looked at the Supreme Court, I began to see the same groups showing up there in the effort to pack the court.
From the get-go, the push to get Justice Breyer to retire has been spearheaded by a shady network of well-heeled dark money groups that are working to subvert, not just to change or add to our judiciary, but to change our entire system of government.
Lastly, we'll end our show with a look at a few sets of survey results from recent years. 3 in 4 American adults, or 75%, perceive corruption as widespread in the country's government. This Gallup poll was released in 2015. Fast forward to 2018, only few think big political donors do not have more influence than others, according to the Pew Research Center. And last year, in a global report released by Transparency International, corruption in the US was found to be at its worst in almost a decade. When voters cast their ballots, just like they're about to do on November 8th, they expect their votes to matter. What they're hoping for and deserve is to see those they have chosen to be responsive to, reflective of, and responsible for the communities they serve. And that's also what we're hoping to see as well. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you like our show, remember to click like and subscribe. Also, leave your comments down below and tell us how you think. I'll see you guys next time. I'm Saina. Bye for now.